Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I've been working on my Terence McKenna section of my book lately, and once again, sort of pondering the mysteries of Terence, and particularly enjoying drawing a link between his, high weirdness factor of encountering, an alien voice inside of the mushrooms that he was consuming down in Colombia in the early 1970s, and all the wild and woolly esoteric experiences that came from that, and then really contemplating on the link between that far out kind of thinking and the very pragmatic work that he did along with his brother Dennis that led to their sort of world-shifting publication of cultivation methods for psilocybe mushrooms in 1976 in their pseudonymous publication, Psilocybin Mushrooms, I think that's what it's called. And really thinking about the relationship between the far out and the pragmatic, between the esoteric and the technical, and the way in which Terence's own mind tried to straddle those worlds, his own practice did, but also the fact that he was dealing not with LSD or even synthetic DMT, but really the mushroom, and the way in which the mushroom itself has its own sort of role to play in weaving together these two domains. And these questions about the mushroom and how the mushroom or the psychedelic mushroom can sort of overlap the technical worlds of interconnections of mycelium, of fruiting bodies, of processes of cultivation, and the dissemination of information about cultivation methods, and that whole sort of research protocol can be linked to the extraordinary experiences that psychedelic mushrooms can occasion. And it sort of threw me back to one of my favorite lectures that I saw at the last big MAPS conference, which was by our guest today, Joanna Steinhardt. And she talked about, she's an anthropologist who's just getting her PhD from UC Santa Barbara, and had the great opportunity of focusing in on the DIY mycology as her thesis project. These are folks who are working outside of the domains of typical scientific knowledge production. They're DIY, after all, citizen scientists who are drawn to the mushroom, and are drawn to it both for psychedelic reasons and non-psychedelic reasons. And indeed, one of the interesting things about her project is the way in which it shows another way in which psychedelic experience changes people, changes their attitude towards matter, changes their attitudes towards society and organization and information, all these very important things. But also the ways in which psychedelic mushrooms are not the whole story. That once you start becoming a symbiont with the fungal kingdom, that other sorts of plans, projects, and possibilities become available. So I'm really happy that Joanna decided to join us today on Expanding Minds. So thanks for joining us, Joanna.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Great. Let me just check. Well, I guess maybe start out with talking about the main group that you decided to focus on. I mean, part of your work was ethnography. You wanted to check out who's doing this, and sort of how did you discover the sort of main group that became the source of a lot of your interviews?
So the group, which I call in the article that was based on that presentation is called the Fungal Alliance of the Bay, and that's a pseudonym. They're a group that's based in the Bay Area, and they are an offshoot of a group that's called Radical Mycology that was started in the Pacific Northwest, which is actually a very small group, but they run events, convergences, and they produce media and that sort of thing that has a very far reach. So the Fungal Alliance of the Bay, which I think is actually a really great name. I told that to one of my interlocutors, and they were like, "That's a great name. Can I steal that? Because then they're fab." But so fab. So they're in the style of an ethnography. They're a local group. It's a very sort of localized kind of research. So I'm looking at the cultural history of the Bay Area and California also, and I just joined the group and hung out with them, got to know them, did in-depth interviews, and sort of followed them in their mycological wanderings.
And so what kind of folks are in a group like this? I mean, it must be quite a wide range of characters.
It is. There are a lot of characters, so to speak. And I just, as an aside, like the way that I chose this topic before I knew anything about it was I went to one of their meetings and I really liked them all. I just felt like I can hang out with these people for a couple years. It's diverse in a way in that there's a range of sort of ages, and they're not people who I think would meet and like hang out otherwise, but they share a lot of things that I think really have to do with kind of like West Coast ecological countercultures. A lot of them are involved in the food movement. A lot of them are really into permaculture, natural medicine. They, like, almost all of them have some sort of organic garden or homestead practice. They're all things that are like really familiar if you live around here or, or up into Oregon. I would call it this kind of like lifestyle politics and ecological kind of identities,
Well, one of the interesting things, as I mentioned up top, is the way in which psychedelics and psychedelic mushrooms in particular are one of the ways that people sort of grow towards this sensibility. They discover a different way of being in the world. They become interested with mushrooms. They become interested in plants in general, and in developing a different kind of lifestyle in relationship to their experiences. But it's also not the only way in it. So that's one of the interesting things about your story is it's not primarily a psychedelic story, even though psychedelics play an important role. So I thought maybe we could just start out talking about how people have integrated their psychedelic experiences with mushrooms into their deeper commitment to these practices and these worldviews.
Yeah, so I think part of the reason, like what happened, how I chose this topic was that I was actually studying urban farmers. And to be honest, it was really boring. And I was just like at the beginning of my fieldwork, and I was like, I can't do this. Like I cut arugula for 4 hours, and I was bored by the people I was talking to, and I was just like, I can't do this. And then I ran into one of these radical mycologist people, and we had a conversation, and his path to mushrooms was through Terence McKenna and Paul Stamets, and was very much informed by like psychedelic experiences. And so I sort of assumed that they were all going to be like that. And that sort of psychedelic hook was one of the things that got me, because psychedelics are interesting to me. But then it turned out that wasn't the case in a way that was really interesting to me, which was what I tried to address in that presentation and in the article or in the chapter. Which is that, well, a lot of people came to mushrooms through psychedelics. There were also a lot of people that came to a culture that had been clearly shaped by psychedelics. If you think about American cultural history and this sort of ecological counterculture that comes out of the 70s, but they themselves hadn't done psychedelics. So it was like they were able to access a worldview or experiences of nature or ideas that people would call psychedelic, perhaps, but they were able to access them through other ways. And also, I mean, a couple side notes to this is that I think there was some hesitation with some people to say explicitly, I have these ideas because I ate a bunch of psychedelic mushrooms. So it is possible that it was like concealed in my interviews, but I don't think that actually is a good explanation for the other narratives that I got, because I think that the other narratives are also available to people. You know, I mean, the truth is, like, you eat psychedelic mushrooms and go live the rest of your life, and it all becomes interwoven anyway, right? And I think that there's that feedback loop between, like, when you're, you know, let's say you're like 27, that means you went to college in like the late 2000, what did the knots? Are people saying that now? I don't know. But that, like, those people had psychedelic experiences at some point, but they're embedded and they're of a culture where psychedelics has been a part of that culture for a generation now, you know, like their parents did psychedelics. So I think that there's like a resonance and a feedback that's happening there where we're now in that kind of next generation.
Well, this raises, I think, a really interesting question, I've spoken, I think, about it pretty recently on the show as well, which is that there's sort of an idea that there are certain inherent insights with psychedelic experience, or that they have a large tendency to produce certain kinds of worldviews. And one of those that I think is most supportable is the idea, although I want to ask you what you feel about it, is the idea that somehow the experience of interconnection, of melting the sort of boundary of the self into the world, of recognizing multiple agents and multiple sources of value, even multiple dimensions of existence, that these kinds of experiences, which are often reported by people, tend to lead to or support a more ecological worldview, a worldview that's grounded not just in nature and the way nature works, but also a kind of embrace of complexity or embrace of interconnection as a kind of mode. And obviously there's a sort of politics that comes out of that, and some of the politics that you talk about, the radical part of the radical mycologist, which we can get to in a moment, very much carries on some of those ideas. But I'm wondering, as you looked at it, and particularly thinking about the fact that, as you say, now this is a well-established culture, the association of these ideas. Are you more hesitant to think about psychedelics as having some inherent kind of message? And if that's the case, then is this just sort of a blip, or do you still see that this kind of ecological expression is going to be one of the main ways that people who really try to walk their talk or walk their trip are going to find themselves engaging with the world?
Yeah, that question is so interesting to me, and I think that as an anthropologist, I err on the side of skepticism. And I think that's why my approach was this kind of, that doesn't seem to be the case in what's happening with these people that I spoke to. And so why is that? And that there were people that arrived at what appears to be a psychedelic ecological worldview, but didn't take psychedelics, which quoting one of the people I spoke to, I asked him at some point if he considers himself religious or spiritual, and he said he was a psychedelic naturalist, and I just thought that was such a great term. And he was someone who had one of these classical psychedelic experiences where he ate, I presume it was mushrooms, and very much felt at one with the world, and that's something that he like carried out in his life and inspired him to pursue permaculture and all these other things, to engage with the world as if it's this abundant kind of infinite group of agents, of things that are living in their own way. But I don't know. I'm like, psychedelics are one of these, they're such a unstable thing, the experience itself is unstable. This is the classic set and setting problem, right? And this is like Nicholas Longlitz in his ethnography of the psychedelic scientists. This is this thing that he's constantly turning around, that they're always trying to control somehow, because that's how science works, right? You have a control, and you somehow set some standard that then you measure against. But it just doesn't work with psychedelics, because what are you controlling against? Consciousness itself is malleable. How do you define it? And then they're working on that in some way. And so it's what do I mean? The psychedelics. But so I think there's this you could argue that because there's this feedback loop, this resonance, because of the time, the historical period that psychedelics came into American culture, and people were looking for this kind of counter to modern alienation. And then there was this beginning of a kind of this sort of new environmental sensibility of this post Silent Spring era. That because people were looking for that, they fell into that role, and then the experience itself is shaped that way. I think that now, when people, let's say, to go back to our, this hypothetical 19-year-old, let's say at UC Santa Cruz, who's eating mushrooms. Maybe UC Santa Cruz is a little bit too obvious, but at any American university, and they're eating mushrooms with their friends, there is a set cultural model of what they're going to experience, and it's true, it could go off the rails, right? Because that's the uncertainty, that's the instability of it. But there is a set model that they could have a spiritual experience, they could there's an idea of the kind of wonder that you're supposed to experience. I don't know. So
well, this actually makes me think of something we talked about before the show, which is that earlier you had done some master's work looking at a very different topic, though one that also involved psychedelics, and it was just an example of just how open-ended the results of psychedelics can be, because you were in Israel looking at American Jews who found their way back, or not even necessarily back, but came to embrace hardcore Orthodox Judaism and the full-on Israeli mode, which is no joke. And yet you discovered that some of the motivations that brought them there were sometimes psychedelics, which is not something that that's not part of that normal set and setting matrix for your average 19-year-old to eat mushrooms at a university. But so that really fascinates me. So talk a little bit about that, and how you came to see the function that psychedelics had played in those lives, which is clearly a different tale.
I think it played this. What's amazing is I think it played the same function, but if you because. So they also, I think a lot of those, most of them were young men, but there were some young women that also had this experience, that they were experimenting with psychedelics as teenagers or at college, which was also my experience. And it opened them up to this sort of realm of experience that they then wanted answers for, or they wanted to channel in some way, which is partially using their language. And part of that, which I think a lot of it also comes from American identity politics, that they were squeamish about appropriating someone else's culture. And then there was also this question of what do I have? What can I bring to this? What was our tradition, And then they start studying Judaism, and they stumble on Shlomo Carlebach, who you talked about a little bit in your talk at the Roxy. And Carlebach, his whole thing was finding these hippies in the 60s and 70s and bringing Hasidism to them, Hasidut, this mystical philosophy of Judaism. It takes the Kabbalah, the mystical sort of tradition, and then Hasidism actually started in the 1700s, but there's this neo-Hasidic kind of revival that he is part of, and he used to say that giving Hasidut to these people was like giving them heroin in a way. I mean, which sounds unhealthy, but that it was like they were so hungry for something, and you see that too with the younger people. So there is this like return narrative of returning to Judaism, and even, I mean, that's one of the things that resonates across these kind of like American countercultural use of psychedelics, of people trying to return to some other state of harmony where they're aligned with the universe, and somehow that opens them up. But it also reminds me of Charles Taylor has, you know, his slant on all this is that you have these moments of, I mean, it's basically like the classic moment of what did Durkheim call that, where you're like effervescence, you know, you have the moment of effervescence, and that some people are okay with just having that moment, but a lot of people want to, they can't just have the moment and let it go, like you, which is also, you find that in psychedelic discourses, right? Of like, what do we do with it?
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting is how some people who aren't satisfied with just having the experience go on a religious quest. And they're fine leaving aside the kind of constraints of naturalism and skepticism in order to pursue and embolden their experiences. But there's also a kind of mode, which I think some of the people you were talking to, like the guy who calls himself a psychedelic naturalist, where they are also inspired to not just go, okay, that was a cool experience, I'm moving on, but to actually live their life differently, to pursue different sources of value and practice based on their revelation, let's call it, except they stay a little closer, if you will, to naturalism. They stay a little bit closer to science, to biology, to human practices, and it's like they, maybe those more sublime mystical dimensions are part of their experience, but it's not really what they're on about. And I think that's a very it's in some ways a more interesting development, possibly a more influential one, or a more needed one at this point in our existence. And so I guess what I would want to ask you about now is how you saw the kind of the politics of these radical mycology groups, the way they approached both dealing with other human beings and particularly dealing with the non-human world as a very explicit, embodied political position that still it was still animated by some of this psychedelic consciousness.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's two sort of answers to that. One is that they were engaging with science in a particular way. I think this is like one of the initial sort of things that fascinated me about this group and what they were doing. I mean, the actual like technical practices is that in order to I mean, as you see in the McKenna's manual, right? In order to cultivate mushrooms, you need to understand microbiology, and you don't just need to understand it. Like, you need to be minimally fluent in it to understand like how to create at least a semi-sterile space, you know, and how to sort of like move around the microbial world to keep your fungus safe from contaminants. So I think that they engage with science in a way that is political, because they're really into open science and DIY science, and this idea that like these capacities should be accessible, you know, and like how do we take this science and make it easy, actually, and like make it so the average person can do it in a way that the average person can experiment with how to apply mycology to solve ecological problems. So that would be like mycoremediation, right? But the other side of it is that so I mean, well, these things are related, but there is this interesting like riffing on um, kind of rhizomatic forms, right? The rhizomorph being the form of that fungi take in the world. So they're not like a plant which has roots and a trunk and leaves and it's very easy to identify a plant, like an individual plant. Fungi are just they're like in another world of how life happens, and what it looks like and how it works, because they like to identify a single fungus is actually difficult. They're in an undifferentiated network, and which like everyone who studies fungi knows that, but like to even wrap your head around that is bizarre. They don't have like there's no, yeah, and even like a plant or an animal or even, I don't know, like a protozoa or something, they're just a network of cells. So anyway, sorry, I went on a tangent. So
it's a relevant tangent.
Yes. I think that you study that, and it's fascinating. There's so many sort of like the way it gets you to think differently about forms of life and forms of living, and one of them is this kind of radical horizontality. This is like the Deleuzian riff on things. Why Deleuze and Guattari loved rhizomorphs, because they're anarchistic. There's this kind of horizontality. It's decentralized, and it is like that in the natural world, from what I understand. Like you can have a giant patch of fungi, which could be a bunch of different individual fungi that are mixed together in different ways. And they interact with their environment and do different things in different parts of their environment, depending on what's needed, even if it's like one organism. So that is something that comes up in the functioning of the group. But it's also, I mean, and also a lot of people in the group have kind of anarchistic leanings, just in terms of decentralization. They're anti-authoritarian, they're radical feminists and that sort of thing. But I think, I mean, it's one of these things that I think is kind of vague, and I think they have those political leanings also just because they all live around here in the Bay Area. And I could see, like, I suspect that there are probably similar DIY mycological kind of communities or leanings in libertarian places. Like I could see that. I could see someone taking those ideas and morphing them into a kind of like right-wing libertarianism too.
Well, I mean, the connection between anarchism and libertarianism is very weird, because it's one of those, like, you loop around and you find yourself in the same place except absolutely opposite. Yeah. And it's that's a whole other story, tracking how even just how those terms operated, and how they also operated inside of the counterculture. I mean, the counterculture, which we think of as for its progressive leftist politics, but it's equally an anti-authoritarian stream within which you're going to find tendencies that some people call libertarianism is just right-wing anarchism, or anarchism of the individual rather than anarchism of the group. So it gets really complicated. But I think the point being is that there is not a necessarily progressive politics implied in these sorts of networks and ideas, that they still take different form in different soil, as it were. But one, go ahead.
Can I just add about that? One thing that you do come across the more you study them is that just the like immense kind of mutability and diversity and strangeness of life that I think does lend itself to a kind of subversion of gender and the kind of like the social conservative side of things. I think that there is something there, because like there's no, like, there's this thing recently with this conservative philosopher in Canada who published this book where he like is using all these different life forms to argue that the traditional like nuclear family is natural, right? Quote unquote natural. I mean, fungi are just one among many other life forms that are just like, I mean, there are fungi there are species that have 13,000 sexes. There's just anyway.
Yeah. Well, and another thing that happens that I think is perhaps related to this is that we're not just talking about other forms of life as models for human existence or human sociality. It's that the humans who get involved with these other forms of life, both consciously and unconsciously, become kind of symbiotic with them.
Yeah.
And that there's this whole story of symbiote, and that some of the people you were talking to very much conceive of what they're doing as kind of almost being representatives of the fungal reality inside human reality, and trying to bring those two worlds, together a little bit more. And the whole idea of interspecies existence, the way in which you could say that one of the things that's happening in our moment historically is we're kind of waking up to the ways in which human beings are always already embedded in all these relationships with non-human entities. And it seems to me that the mycologist, the radical mycologist, is one where they're bringing that consciousness awake, as a real kind of possibility. So I'm curious, like as an outsider who is also invested in some of these experiences, how did you come to see that question of interspecies or interkingdom relationship that comes up a lot around mushroom heads and really all kind of ethnobotanist heads that I know?
It's funny. So because I have this like skeptical, like I err on the side of skepticism, it took me a really long time to come around to seeing like, oh, it is actually what they say it is. Like I call them the fungal alliance of the Bay because this alliance language is everywhere in this culture, coming from, beginning with McKenna and both of the McKennas, and then through Paul Stamets. And the thing is, though, the more you look at it, like, alliance is maybe a wishful word to use, but there is this, just the history of how psilocybe, which is the Latin term for that genus, how psilocybe mushrooms were like discovered and spread around, urban areas and also para-urban areas, like these kind of farmlands around cities, is amazing. You see, like, people become obsessed with them. They start discovering them. So you have like Paul Stamets and Gaston Guzman and Jonathan Ott and these, mycologists who are going around the Pacific Northwest in like the early mid 70s. I think it's more the mid 70s. They start discovering all these other species. And then hippies start picking them, and the spores are being spread all over, right? So you see, like, they're kind of this weed mushroom. They like grow all over, but then as soon as people start paying attention to them and feeling, affection for them and wanting to cultivate them, they start to spread. And it's interesting. There was actually a really great little article that came out about the spread of psilocybin mushrooms in the UK, where the title is Aliens in the Flower Bed, which is just a great title. And it's written by two mycologists, and they're trying to figure out, how did these alien species, in the sense that they're not native to the UK, they're not considered native to the UK, how did they start showing up, like, in, mulching all over like urban areas? And they don't really have an answer, but they suspect it has to do with, the rise of mulching, the rise of like landscape, like gardens and stuff, and these kind of like institutional gardens, which is fairly recent. But it's not like, you can't, like, psilocybe cyanescens, which was discovered in the 50s by a mycologist. She's actually like a plant pathologist at Kew Gardens in London. And so that's, that's where it was discovered. That's like the what's it called, the holotype or something. Like if you go look at they probably have it in the herbarium at Kew Gardens. But then no one really knows where it's native to. Like Paul Stamets finds, he finds, related mushrooms all over the Pacific Northwest. And he, somewhere I think he said that he thinks they're probably native to the dunes, like in the Pacific Northwest and the Washington area. But who knows? Like, how did it end up at Kew Gardens in the mid-50s? It's obviously been there for a while. So, I mean, you could say, well, maybe a mycologist went there to do something and they carried its spores. But, like, I don't think people knew that species existed before and I don't know when they, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so it's like,
well, what's funny is what you're describing is that it's one of the things about thinking in a fungal way is that you come across the same pattern at different levels of scale, and which is a kind of complicated way of leading to the observation that what you're talking about there, which is that basically if you start to go looking for mushrooms, you start finding mushrooms. But this is also very much the experience of foragers. And like one of the most remarkable kind of states of consciousness that you can shift into is you go looking for something, like you're hunting for, psilocybe cyanescens, and you're in they're somewhere and you don't see them, you're walking around, you're bumping in, you're pulling up other things, blah, blah, and then suddenly you notice one, and then you notice more, and then you tune in, and then you see them. And foragers talk about this all the time, this kind of sort of sympathetic perception that suddenly changes kind of a landscape, and it almost feels that's part of the kind of now you see them, now you don't game of the mushroom. And it's even the case that, like, in a field, if there's no fruiting bodies, we don't know there's any mycelium. Who knows? And then, like, boom, there they are one night, bang, okay, now we know they're there. And so there's this sort of game of concealment and revelation and tuning in that seems to be true of the mushroom, again, at multiple levels of scale.
Right. Yeah, totally. And that's actually the chapter I just finished for my dissertation talks a lot about that, which a lot of it is actually sort of inspired and picking up on these ideas and stories that Paul Stamets tells in a lecture that he gave in 1999, and then it went on YouTube. I don't know when, probably not too long ago. Have you seen it? It's a psychoactivity conference.
I don't think so. I mean, I've seen him speak, but I don't think I've seen that one.
So it's like, it's when he's sort of like crystallizing the ideas in Mycelium Running, and it's after the like manuals and kind of like moving on to more philosophical kind of like topics. And he goes on these riffs about all the different ways you can cultivate these wild psilocybes in your garden, but also like in like farmland, basically. And in like where they grow, that there's a bunch of them that grow in like they grow symbiotically with grass seed, like in, I guess in Washington, they, it's a major industry of like producing seeds for grass. And this is one of these things that, like, yeah, of course, I never would think about it otherwise, but of course, yeah, there's a giant industry for people that create grass seeds because there's all these lawns in our society, So apparently there's this species, which I can't remember which one, I think it was some Simolenciata, that grows symbiotically with these grass seeds. So they would go to these farms, which are not really tended, right? And there just are like millions of mushrooms. And there's like a bunch of other cases like that, where it's like people in the know will kind of semi-cultivate these species that are already growing wild, and they're getting spread all over the country. So it's like, it's pretty amazing. That's a great lecture that like everyone should watch. Scott.
Great, I'll check that out. What's the name of it? I mean, how do we find?
I think if you just look like Paul Stamets psychoactivity,
okay,
1999,
yeah,
on YouTube.
Well, one of the things this also leads to that Stamets talks about, and you also write about, is how if you take this rhizomatic, networked, mycelial kind of mind frame, and you bring it into the level of technology, of course, we start talking about the internet. And of course, the internet, just as a dissemination device, was part of this process. I mean, if we can look at, if we want to tell the story from the psilocybe's point of view, it's going to talk about exploiting all of these weird liminal zones that human beings create in their farmland, the disturbed soil. But they also kind of went, oh yeah, we could move it through this internet thing through, and by the way, thereby disseminate all this information, including cultivation techniques. And one of the things that you look at that I'd love to hear more about is how, partly through the internet, that the technology of cultivation itself kind of developed from, let's say, the McKenna's first handbook, leading through PF Tech and all this kind of stuff. So that technical story also seems to be resonant, if you will, with this kind of larger fungal archetype. So what did you find when you tracked that technical story?
That was like another case where I was like, it can't be like that. That's too obvious. And then like you get further into it and you're like, oh my God, it is like that. It's this network of networks. Like you have the fungal network and then you have the internet. And I mean, that's another thing that like Paul Stamets often says is there's a mycelial archetype, the internet, it's also one of these truisms of just like how the internet revolutionized everything. But I mean, it's amazing. Like, so the PF Tech, which was really it was one guy's invention, Psilocybe fanaticus, but it spread so fast. And what was amazing about that invention, which also I should say, like he was building on all these other cultivators that were sharing knowledge, but is that he found a way to do it really with like minimal sterilization needs, so you don't need like a huge autoclave. You don't need to worry about your autoclave exploding. You don't need to worry about like all these, you need to worry a little bit, but it's like pretty much he found a way to like get that out of the frame, which is fascinating in terms of this like evolution towards accessibility and just ease of use, and making it like, they call it foolproof. I don't know, it is pretty foolproof. Everyone I know who's ever like grown psychedelic mushrooms, they always use that method. It's so easy to find. You just Google PF Tech. But then there were a number of other like little tweaks that came out of these forums that were started in like 1995, or maybe a little earlier actually. But there's Shroomery and Mycotopia. And both of those are just these like classic internet forums full of people. Like a lot of it is technical stuff, but there's also like these philosophical, they have sub threads and, who knows what's on there. But they, people like tinker and then they would upload their photos, and through all these people reading together, and like a lot of them, they don't know they're under pseudonyms, they came up with these like great, it's like a crowdsourced innovation. You have like the airport lid, which is this also like, it makes it so much easier if you don't have an autoclave, and like monotubs and all kinds of things that I probably don't even know about. There's also just like really weird shit on there. Like if you want to try to figure out how to like actually grow cordyceps on worms, I found a thread on there. There's like a guy who did it. There's probably several guys who did it. You like buy the mealworms on the internet. Anyway, there's also like YouTube videos. There's a bunch of PDFs you can download. People I know who learn cultivation now just do it online. You don't even need to buy a book anymore.
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable that the whole growth of citizen science, and it's interesting to think about the mycology and other and chemistry as well, but the ways in which are people's interest in psychedelics and in exploring novelty in psychedelics has really been a source of citizen science. And if you're like pro citizen science, you gotta like kind of chalk it up to drugs, because it got so many people learning about all this stuff and being interested in it, and then not only just for their own benefit, but it's almost invariably linked into a notion of shared culture and shared information. I think one of the interesting things that's happening right now, as a kind of side note, or maybe something that we could comment on now, is how, as the psychedelic renaissance, steamrolls forward, and more official bodies, organized bodies, professional bodies, corporate bodies, pharmacological firms, et cetera, start wanting their piece of the pie that's obviously going to be becoming much larger, how the citizen science aspect of existing psychedelic culture, or the psychedelic underground, is confronting a very different kind of intellectual property regime. And it's going to be very strange to see these, or very mutant to watch these processes happen. And, it seems to me that in a way, this kind of raises maybe a more mythological question, that the fact that, psilocybin on the one hand is playing such an important role in the psychedelic renaissance, unlike LSD, unlike smoked DMT. Ayahuasca is coming in, sort of, but like the mushroom works. It's short, it's knowable, we understand it, but it's also synthesized. So we have suddenly this rise in awareness around psilocybin, or the mushroom, but at the same time there's this weird pull, which again is more mythological than anything, between this whole world of cultivation that's deeply embedded in biology and in interspecies relationships and the morphology of mycelium, and at the same time the same old Western extraction, synthesis, decoupling from those networks. Have you thought about that? What do you see as is there some interesting tensions going there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought about it a little bit, not super in depth, but I mean, one thing that is interesting, like we were talking about, that that sort of feedback loop of the set and setting, that there, up until now, I think it's been really clear what the kind of cultural narratives were around what a trip is. And it did involve nature somehow. And I think that we're starting to see some divergences there, I mean, clearly, like, those cultural narratives are also informing the experiences of people in these trials, which is something I've always wondered about, I don't know if any anthropologists are working on that right now, but I mean, besides Patricia, who I mentioned before, who's studying psychedelic therapy, but I kind of think, I mean, the way they set up the room is really interesting, right? In these trials, they set up a very cozy room. They put certain things on the walls, like there's kind of a genre of art that they put on the wall. And there's kind of an idea of like what that physical experience is supposed to be like. They're not going out and walking through a redwood forest, they're not like, although I do think that they have pictures of natural things on the wall. And I think there's already an idea of the sort of healing experience that you're supposed to have, that is a psychological, I mean, sort of a psycho-spiritual experience, right? So I don't know. I feel like there might be a kind of divergence in those.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to ask a little bit about your own experiences, since obviously you're partly interested in these topics because of your own exposure to psychedelics and how interesting they are. Yeah. And I guess maybe in a way I'm coming back to this question about nature. I mean, for me, I'm okay with the idea that it's just a story, that psychedelics are intimately involved with nature or the non-human world. I'm okay if that's just a story. I'm gonna stick with it. I'm interested in the ways in which these things force me out of the human. I'm wary of the ways in which the human circuit just reinvests itself, and that psychedelics can also just kind of drive this sort of circularity of merely human signs, whereas what interests me about it is how it forces a confrontation or an encounter to some degree outside of that. But I'm just kind of maybe curious, as you've studied psychedelics, thought about this issue of set and setting, the feedback loops of expectation, and indeed been exposed to some of the ways that other people have constructed their psychedelic experiences, either becoming Orthodox Jews or becoming radical anarchist foragers. How that's sort of shaped in your own experience? Like, how much do you feel like you're just stuck inside your own set and setting, or are there ways in which the awareness of these processes have actually changed your experiences?
It's really interesting. I mean, while you were talking about it, I just realized that I think so many of my ideas come from my personal experience, because I first took psychedelics when I was very young, as like a young teenager. And I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit. And so I was involved in the party scene there, which is like the techno scene. So I was going to these like rave parties, although we didn't really call them raves. But so I was taking psychedelics in like the most artificial setting you can imagine. In like if you were going to have a movie setting of like urban dystopia, like in these sort of like abandoned warehouses, basically, where like you walk outside and you're like in an industrial zone of Detroit. So, and I definitely had blissed out, sublime experiences. That was mostly on LSD. And so but it wasn't, was it related? I don't know. It's like the natural world played into it, but it wasn't a huge part of my experience. And even later taking mushrooms, like I think it's possible to have to have an experience that has nothing to do with the natural world. But I think actually part of, I think I totally lost your question, and now I'm just, but I think part of the thing is that you take these substances and you have an experience that is completely abnormal to your consciousness, right? And you come out of it and you're like, what the fuck just happened? Like, what was that, right? I think that everybody who has an intense psychedelic experience, there's some feeling of that after. And if you ate a mushroom, then you think, well, it was a mushroom, right? Like, what did that mushroom do to me? There's this kind of like, it came from a thing that grows out of the earth. And where it's a pill that's given to you by a doctor or by some dude at a party, it's a different, there's something about the like the origin of the substance and like where in the sort of like social world that you're embedded in. I totally lost your question.
No, you were totally running with it. It was just how these kinds of issues impact our own experiences. I mean, I guess another version of that, or a way of kind of moving towards a conclusion, is whether from the psychedelic experience or really just your exposure to this sort of rhizomatic politics, both of science and of relating to the natural world and the food world, which we haven't really talked about. But how much you've seen that kind of change your own life, your own practices, like how have you just sort of naturally pursued it, or is it almost like, oh my God, before I just turned around and now I'm suddenly one of these people, or how much have you become? Has your participant observation line sort of shifted as you've done this research?
Well, I never tripped with anybody in my fieldwork. I will say that. I think when I started, I thought I would, and then I'd have a chapter about the quote unquote field trip, and it would be funny, but I never did that. To be honest, I mean, I think I had, as as I call him Oscar in the article, as Oscar calls himself a psychedelic naturalist, I think I already had that worldview. And I've also done a bunch of other psychedelics. So, there was like LSD, there was psilocybin, and then there was a long break. And then when I came back to it, I did psilocybin again. And, I remember where I was going before. That the first time I took psilocybin again, this is like when I was, in my early 30s. It was a very comfortable experience. Like I hadn't tripped in like 15 years. And it as it came on, and I'm like, I'm back in this mind space again. It was this familiar mind space, like I knew what it was. I felt comfortable in it. So that it's like I knew what to expect, and I guess that's what I was saying about this like feedback thing. I mean, it also happens on an individual level. Like I didn't have any like urge to connect with nature. I just felt happy, like giggling at things, and then after that, I also took Ibogaine like a couple years later. And so all of these things kind of like cumulatively give me, my idea of reality is definitely psychedelic. So I think I was already there, and actually, and I think that background also lends itself really well to anthropology as a side note.
Yeah, but, I agree. I think I very much agree that I think one way you go through these experiences is you come out an anthropologist. I mean, if you're not a believer type, if you are more of you have a skeptical leaning, what you come up with is anthropology, including the enigmas of anthropology, the experiences that you can't explain, or the participant observer relationship that breaks down, and then suddenly you're seeing the spirits that you're the people you're studying are seeing. You're like, whoa, what's happening? There are these feedback loops that I think have go beyond rational explanation, right. but you can still approach them anthropologically.
And I think that one of the things that you get from psychedelics, or at least that I got from it, is this sense of the kind of like the abundance of reality, and this kind of like there's a sense of the infinite in it, and all the different ways things could be and could be seen, and I think that's why, like, it's funny because I'm saying that is something that I got from psychedelics, but I think it's possible to get there in other ways.
Right. Well, I think we're going to have to wind it up there. So, Joanna, thanks so much for talking to us on Expanding Mind.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right, folks, until next week, keep your minds open.